When you think of the Roman Empire, what comes to mind? Probably legions, aqueducts, emperors, and togas. It was this incredible, sprawling machine that dominated the ancient world. But what actually fueled it? What kept this whole thing running for centuries? I mean, just try to wrap your head around that. 50 million people. You've got to feed massive cities, pay hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and build all those famous monuments and roads. So where did all that wealth, all that stuff, actually come from? Well, you might guess it came from trade or some amazing new technology, but the real answer is a lot more direct and a lot more brutal. You see, we tend to think of economies as being driven by commerce, by buying and selling. But for Rome, that wasn't the main driver. The real fuel for the Roman economic machine was compulsion. We're talking about taxes and tribute, extracted from the vast territories they had conquered. This quote really flips everything we assume about economies on its head. Today, trade happens, creating wealth that governments can then tax. In Rome, it was the other way around. The state needed to move its tax revenue, which was often paid in goods like grain, not just coin, and in doing so, it created the very shipping lanes that private merchants could then use. Tax didn't just fund the empire, it literally created the conditions for large-scale commerce to even exist. Now, in the early days of the Republic, this system was, well, it was a mess, a total free-for-all. Rome outsourced tax collection to private companies called the publicani. Think about this business model. They'd bid for a contract, pay the government a huge lump sum up front, and then they had the right to go to a province and collect the taxes. Anything they collected above what they'd paid the government was pure profit. You can probably guess what that led to, right? Yeah, rampant extortion and legendary corruption. So that chaotic system obviously couldn't last. The big change came with the rise of the empire. Emperors like Augustus looked at this and said, "No way, this is far too unstable." So they largely did away with the publicani and created a much more centralized system. They used imperial officials and regular census lists to administer taxes. It was a more direct and, frankly, a much more predictable way of extracting wealth. So you might be wondering, just how heavy were these taxes? Well, historians estimate the total imperial tax burden was only around 5% of the empire's gross product. Now, that might sound surprisingly low, doesn't it? But that light touch had a massive side effect. It allowed the Roman aristocracy to build up absolutely staggering personal fortunes. We're talking about private wealth that could sometimes even rival the entire budget of the state. Okay, so the state is pulling in all this wealth in the form of taxes and tribute, but how did they move it all? How did you get grain from Egypt all the way to Italy or metals from Spain to the frontiers? This brings us to the real highways of Roman commerce. This number right here tells you everything you need to know. It was up to 60 times cheaper to ship goods by sea than to haul them over land. So despite their legendary roads, the empire's true economic lifeblood flowed on the water. The Mediterranean wasn't a barrier. It was their superhighway. It's no wonder they called it Mare Nostrum, our sea. And because sea travel was so cheap and efficient, different parts of the empire could specialize, a lot like our modern global economy. Egypt was the breadbasket, churning out massive amounts of grain, but also luxury goods like linen and papyrus. Italy exported high-value products like wine and olive oil. Spain provided the precious metals, while tin came all the way from Britain. The whole empire was this deeply interconnected web of production. But the key to this whole shipping network, the thing that really made it all tick, was something called the annona. This was the massive state-run operation to ship tribute grain from places like Egypt to feed the enormous population of the city of Rome. This wasn't a commercial business. It was a state necessity. It's how emperors kept the people fed and happy. The government essentially compelled ship owners to transport this grain, and in the process, created and secured the entire shipping infrastructure that private merchants then piggybacked on for their own goods. But this raises a pretty basic question. All of this taxable land, these resource-rich provinces, this tribute grain, where did it all come from in the first place? The answer gets to the very core of the Roman identity: conquest. For Rome, war wasn't just about security or glory. War was a business. In fact, it was their primary business model. Think about it. Every single conquest fed directly into this economic machine. A new province meant a whole new base of taxpayers. It meant getting your hands on valuable resources, like the gold and silver mines of Spain. It provided vast farmlands, like those in Egypt, to supply the annona. And, crucially, it supplied a constant stream of enslaved people who formed the backbone of labor for Roman farms, mines, and industries. And the scale of this resource extraction was just staggering. Using advanced techniques like hydraulic mining, the Romans achieved a level of production that was basically proto-industrial. They were pumping out an estimated 80,000 tons of lead and 15,000 tons of copper every single year. These are levels of production that the world would not see again until the Industrial Revolution, over 1,000 years later. It's just mind-boggling. And if you want one statistic to really put this into perspective, here it is. At its peak, the Roman Empire held an estimated 10,000 tons of silver. That single stock of wealth was 5 to 10 times larger than all the silver held by medieval Europe and the Great Opposite Caliphate combined. We are talking about wealth on a completely different scale, and it was all made possible by conquest. All right, so let's pull all these threads together. What we've seen is an economy fueled by taxes, enabled by state-run logistics, and founded on military expansion. It was an incredibly powerful, self-perpetuating system. It really worked like a loop. Step 1, conquer territory. Step 2, extract resources and taxes from that territory. Step 3, use that revenue to fund your massive professional army. And Step 4, use that army to go out and conquer more territory. Then you just start the cycle all over again. For centuries, this engine of expansion seemed absolutely unstoppable. But here's the inherent vulnerability of any system built on endless growth. What happens when you run out of places to grow? Eventually, the empire hit its physical limits. There were no more wealthy, easy provinces left to conquer. The problem was, the costs didn't go away. That massive armies still had to be paid. But now, the money had to be squeezed from existing lands, not from new conquests, and that put an immense financial strain on the whole system. And this right here exposed the fatal flaw at the very heart of the Roman economic machine. It leaves us with one final critical question that would come to define the later Roman Empire. What happens when an engine that's built for endless growth simply runs out of road?